I would like to make a couple of statements regarding this podcast. First, I apologize if you hear any banging in the background. It is unavoidable, and I will try to prevent that next time. Second, this is the second major attempt at doing this podcast. I had originally planned for there to be a guest with me as a co host, but unfortunately, we discovered after the recording was done that after about a minute and a half of audio, he cuts off and we completely lose his voice for the entirety of that podcast. And we spent well over half an hour discussing all of what we're about to go into detail here. So we had to restart. Thank you, Will, for joining me the other day. I'm sorry we lost your audio. Maybe next time we'll be able to remedy this problem so we can do it properly next time. Before diving into today's discussion, I would like the audience to imagine this scenario. In 1643, armies under the command of the Papal States have finally defeated the remnants of the Italian city-states, and the Pope, upon his throne in Rome, has officially declared the kingdom of God on earth, and has sent subsidies to the Austrians as they finish mopping up the French in their conquests of the region. When one thinks of alternative history video games, many people do tend to gravitate towards more popular franchises like Assassin's Creed, Call of Duty, Wolfenstein, and several others due to their immense popularity and addictive action oriented gameplay. And I give them that. They do provide the means for exploring some of these alternative histories. However, when I imagine an alternative history video game, my thoughts tend to gravitate towards grand strategy games like Total War and any number of games from the studio Paradox Interactive. This gaming studio is headquartered in Stockholm, Sweden, established in 2004, and has published more than 100 titles. But they're more known for their grand strategy games. Grand strategy um, is referred to as a game where it's usually a war game that places most of the focus towards military strategy and its impact on overall statecraft. The Paradox Studios have used grand strategy to create games where players can traverse and explore the world from as far back as the Romans in Imperator Rome to World War II and beyond in Hearts of Iron and Stellaris. Uh, by looking at the game design of Paradox Interactive's grand strategies and how the community itself interacts with these games, we can see how the studio has created the means for an infinite amount of alternative histories, where some of these other alternative history or historical based video games only focus on one said story, while at the same time acknowledging some of the major critiques that Grand Strategy and Paradox Interactive have had as a whole. I mean, as a person being very familiar with playing Paradox Interactive games, as of the moment of this recording, I have over 1,500 hours recorded in Europa Universalis 4, or EU4 as it's more commonly known as, and over 800 hours in Hearts of Iron 4. The overall design, whether it be advertising or game design, encourages the audience to buy these games and play an alternative history paths. When you're looking at their marketing of the game, they do a really good job in pointing out the fact that they do focus on people exploring alternative histories. Many of their trailers, most notably or most recently in Hearts of Iron's No Step Back DLC, they kind of encourage players to take a different path for Russia that normally players of the game, we're all familiar with the fact that Russia for the longest time had only a historical path. But with this DLC, they wanted to bring it across to people that you can now play a myriad of paths in this game in Russia that were not normally offered to people, while at the same time introducing new new game features that try to spice and keep the game fresh and extend its lifespan. Um, this is one of their major methods, and it usually is effective, but it's not their most at drawing in alternative history people, but it is not their most well established means of doing this. Those two methods are the usage of the mission slash focus trees and achievement systems in the game to do the alternative histories. In these grand strategy games, Paradox introduces these missions and focuses to encourage alternative world building. Usually, these paths will give bonuses or other rewards to the player if they take sorry, if they take an alternative path, while at the same time not discrediting the value for those people who would choose to play a historical path. Um, Usually these will give you money, bonus, other major, other military bonuses, political power, prestige, and others. And one example of looking at at these focus trees is uh, from Hearts of Iron 4 with Germany's focus tree. In in one of the game's earlier DLCs, if I'm not mistaken, it was in Waking the Tiger. They Paradox gave Germany a new tree, which differed from all the other ones because before this point, like Russia, they didn't really have an alternative path. But with what this DLC did is it introduced to the player the option of going one of four paths. Either you could remain as the fascists, or you could go monarchist and return the Kaiser, communist and join the Comintern, or democratic and join the Allies. I would like to note that these four paths are the only government types that are available in the game. What this does overall is with these missions, they provide the players the capability of doing a choose your own adventure style gameplay, while at the same time also introducing the means of people creating their own alternate history, which I think is the greatest thing that these games do. Not only with the trailers, but working in conjunction with the focus trees and missions, Paradox Interactive and games in general use achievement systems to reward players for differing off the beaten path. Sorry. While there are no special rewards that you see in like the mission trees that are given directly to the player after doing a certain path, the reward of an achievement usually people usually would hunt these achievements for bragging rights. Um, is one example of these bragging because usually players will want to tend towards saying, "Oh, I 100%ed this game." Um, but in these grand strategy games, doing that it does give its big one of the biggest flaws with Paradox Interactive is that it greatly differs from historical plausibility in which whereas you would play for instance take the Three Mountains achievement in Europa Universalis 4. Starting as Ryukyu, which is a really small island south of Japan, you're supposed to conquer the entire world. Well, this is one of the most popular achievements that major people have done in the game. It it doesn't at all remain be in the possibility of realistic, but it is usually used to try to get people to play differently from the historical path. But again, when referring to a good alternative past achievement system, look at Hearts of Iron for Hearts of Iron 4's Germany tree. In their monarchist route, you get achievements based on reaching certain parts in that focus tree, where after replacing the Kaiser, I think you get an achievement for getting back the Danzig Strip. You get one for claiming back some of your territories lost by the Treaty of Versailles. Well, I mean, it wasn't really likely that this would have happened. It kind of goes to show that they want you to play alternative paths, and they will be willing to reward the player for taking these alternative routes. I guess another good example of a more possibly plausible scenario is in EU4, where starting as England, you win the Hundred Years' War and you conquer Paris back from the French. I think that's one of the more likely ones that we look at when delving into these historical fiction achievements or alternative history achievements. While doing research into into these games, I stumbled upon an officially published ebook by Paradox that delved into some of the possible alternative histories that players could see when playing this game. In their in EU4's Anthology of Alternate History, Paradox Interactive collaborates with multiple authors, most notably Harry Turtledove, who was known for writing a book series in which the Confederates won the American Civil War, to compile a selection of these short stories in, quote, a history that never was. These three major features created by Paradox Interactive served as a catalyst where the community surrounding these games takes the tools that the games provide and runs with it in creating their own alternative histories. As a member of the overall Paradox gaming community, it is truly amazing to see how far people go in creating these alternate histories. Perhaps the most commonly known form of community interaction with these games was that Paradox was willing to let players modify their titles so that several of these alternative paths can be explored. Um, in EU4, there's a mod where it usually the game runs from 1444 to 1821, but there's a mod in this game where it goes all the way back to the year 2, and then it runs all the way to the distant future. So you could start at any period from the year 2 to the year 9999, and you could pick any of the countries from Rome, from as big as Rome to as small as Ulm or a one province minor in some Europe, far off region. Um, but it lets you go to any of these points in history um, and change the world and maybe introduce situations where Rome never collapsed or the the Sultanate or the Caliphate wasn't defeated in France. Um, there is one instance where, in a study published in 2021 by Rhett Loban, we see that when conducting a survey of people who are known to mod EU4, about 69% of the participants emphasize that they directly, quote, learned about history, geography, or other subjects when they're modding the game. This this statement alone goes to show that people to highlight that the popularity of modding can be used as a teaching method for people, which is a topic that will be discussed later. Um, when looking at modding in particular, one of the another really good example of this really well made world building is in a Hearts of Iron mod called Kaiserreich. In this mod, the creators set out to answer the question, what would it look like in the world where Germany had won World War One? If you're more interested in looking in detail about this Kaiserreich world, I strongly encourage you to check out Alternate History Hub's video, The World of Kaiserreich. It does a far better job of explaining the lore than I have time for and probably would have the capability of doing. But This article and video go to show how modding can not only s- scratch an itch that a book or a lesson might offer, but it has been proven to help encourage people to explore alternative pasts and foster creative world building, which I think is very important in this day and age. Um, eh, like I mentioned earlier about teaching, another major feature of not only Paradox titles, but in general, a historically grounded video game, whether it be directly historical or an alternative history, is that the capability for teachers to implement some of these titles into their curricula as a teaching method. And Laura Radich and Eduardo Japoges, oh, sorry, I butchered that name, but it's hard for me to pronounce. There's a 2015 article that highlight that there's an interaction between a historical video game and history can help quote learners question the narrative of historiography from argumentation or complex thought. Martin Wright's 2014 article also kind of highlights similar notions that one can teach historical theory through these video games, and that it actually could help students tackle material that is frequently difficult for most students to comprehend in more conventional classroom and seminar settings. Personally, I think that we should introduce to the teaching algorithm these historical video games because not only the points mentioned by Rainwright, Radich, Jacobos, and Loban, but because for some people, learning from reading a book or sitting in a classroom might not be as effective as, say, physically, I say physically, but interacting with the game itself where it could appeal to students who aren't really those kinds of learners. I think that this is really important that we should take a look in to maybe implementing in the future. While there are a lot of really good features that come from these infinite alternative histories, Paradox Interactive titles and grand strategy games as a whole are not prone to being without their own critiques. While conducting research for this podcast, I stumbled upon two major critiques of both of grand strategy games. The first of these comes from Johannes Ashim in their 2022 or 2021 master's thesis titled "Playing Hitler: The Representation of Nazism in Hearts of Iron 4." In Ashim's argue that while the game wants to encourage gameplay and historical accuracy, developer Paradox primarily focused on the former, while at the same time not taking a stance for or against Nazism, which might be seen as a overall negative impact on society by underrepresenting the atrocities of the Reich. I I do recognize where this is coming from. I mean, after playing the game, they don't really go out of their way to highlight some of the darker sides of any country during this time period, but most notably the Reich. They only say, "Oh, well, the only time they ever introduce some of these things are like small snippets that they don't really have much weight to them." The second article critiquing grand strategy games as a whole is that it could perpetuate they could inadvertently perpetuate colonialist agendas. Um, Sovik Mukherjee, again, I apologize if I butchered your name, highlights that grand strategy games like the Total War franchise, and the East India Company games, that while advertising to the audience that they encourage people going into alternative histories, these games at the same time frame everything according to quote the rules of the colonial game. While not explicitly mentioning any of the paradox titles in this article, after reading it, I could I could clear as day see what this is in these paradox titles. Most notably in EU4, in the game, they strongly encourage you to colonize. They give you a bonus again. They in order for your to be able to survive from 1444 to 1821, you need to be able to maintain profits and keep money up. And one of the ways to do this was to colonize Africa, where there are, or and the Americas and East Asia, where there are vast amounts of quote unquote like wasteland or unsettled lands where you send a colonist to and you colonize. And all it is just you click a button and you colonize. I can see where this critique is coming from. It the way that this system doesn't really emphasize the brutality that the subjugated people felt during this time. And she mentions that during, particularly in her critique of the East India Company part, is that how would people from the Indies feel while playing this game? It doesn't really take that into mind. It only really focuses on overall map painting, which is again the biggest flaw of these games is that they get people too enthralled into doing vast map painting, and I'm a victim of that. I like map painting. It's addictive, but again it is very dangerous because it will tend to overlook the the oppressed. Well, both of the critiques that these Mukherjee and um, Yo, Ashim provided, they are very, very valid critiques of Paradox Interactive and grand strategy games as a whole. But I genuinely think that they are not damning. Because these games, yes, while doing kind of not being the best when it comes to representing the oppressed or not or ignoring or glossing over the atrocities of the Nazis or anybody, they still enable the players to explore alternative histories in which many of these games oftentimes do not do. In conclusion, I personally think that Paradox Interactive games like Europa Universalis 4 and Hearts of Iron 4 are extremely valuable for for scholars and people to explore and create their own alternative histories. It I mean, it could be clearly seen in the game design and how the community interacts with Paradox, whether it be through their modding, the design, implementing them into teaching. Uh, it's just it is there. I guess the sky's the limit, as they would say, for what you could do in these games. While at the same time, also having points where you could critique how they did these things. If you have never played any of these grand strategy games from Paradox Interactive or Total War, I do strongly, strongly encourage anybody to try them out and make your own alternative histories because I think that when you do that, the biggest benefit that comes from these games is the availability for you to do creative world building, which I think is a skill that is sadly underrepresented. Um, if only these titles, I think if they could be improved, but overall, it's generally seen as a really good thing.